What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 1.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over the quarterback position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 1. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 1 fantasy football starts and sits. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. I'm going to start Jimmy Garoppolo from the San Francisco 49ers playing the Arizona Cardinals, who had the second worst defense overall, and they gave up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks last year. Jimmy Garoppolo averaged 17.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting about 3 rush attempts per game. He didn't play that well at the end of the season last year, but he's got a fantastic matchup here in Week 1. He's projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in Week 1. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game. So a high-scoring game, and they have the San Francisco 49ers favored by 6.5. I don't think you can ignore the matchup here, so I'm going to start Jimmy Garoppolo here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, and on the other side of the ball, I'm going to sit Kyler Murray from the Arizona Cardinals playing the San Francisco 49ers, who had a fantastic defense overall last year, and they were really good against opposing quarterbacks. Kyler Murray averaged 19.6 fantasy points per game on the season last year. He had a great year. He was rushing the ball an average of 5.8 times per game, and he is projected at 18.3 fantasy points here in Week 1. But I'm looking at the matchup here. I'm going to pass on Kyler Murray versus that San Francisco 49ers defense. So I'm going to sit Kyler Murray here versus the San Francisco 49ers. Okay, fantasy football starts and sits. Let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Detroit Lions, who had the third worst defense overall last year, and they gave up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery averaged 11.2 fantasy points per game on the season last year. He got an average of 2.2 pass targets per game and 15.1 rush attempts per game. He did score 20 fantasy points in his last game that he played last year off of 23 rush attempts, and he's projected at 10.1 fantasy points here in Week 1. Vegas thinks there's going to be 42.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Bears favored by 3. So it's a close game, a competitive game, a fantastic matchup. And Montgomery was a full participant in practice on Friday, so it looks like he's going to be good to go for Week 1. So I'm going to start David Montgomery here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, now I'm going to sit Devin Singletary from the Buffalo Bills playing the New York Jets, who had a middle-of-the-pack defense overall last year, but they were really good at stopping the running backs. Devin Singletary averaged 12.7 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 3.4 pass targets per game and an average of 12.6 rush attempts per game. He was only on the field for 50% of the snaps, so he's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in Week 1, but he's got a tough matchup versus the New York Jets. And Vegas only thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Buffalo Bills favored by 6.5. Now, you could make a case that the Buffalo Bills get ahead of the Jets, and Devin Singletary is out there to run out the clock. But because of this bad matchup, I'm going to sit Devin Singletary here versus the New York Jets. Okay, fantasy football, week 1. Let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start DK Metcalf from the Seattle Seahawks playing the Atlanta Falcons, who had a middle-of-the-pack defense overall last year, and they were middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. DK Metcalf averaged 12.1 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 6.3 pass targets per game, and he was on the field for 84% of the snaps. He's a huge red zone target. He gets a ton of red zone looks, and he scored 10, 32, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games of the season last year. He's projected at 14.1 fantasy points here in week 1. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game. So a high-scoring game, and they have the Seahawks favored by 3. So this should be a competitive game. It's a pretty decent matchup here. So I'm going to start DK Metcalf here versus the Atlanta Falcons.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
And one more start here at the wide receiver position for you. I'm going to start DeSean Jackson from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Washington football team, who had the 4th worst defense overall last year, and they were middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. DeSean Jackson averaged 13.3 fantasy points per game on the season last year, only getting an average of 3.3 pass targets per game. But this guy has big playmaking ability, and he scored 38 fantasy points versus the Washington football team last year. He's projected at 12 fantasy points here in week 1. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, and they have the Eagles favored by 5.5. So pretty good matchup here. I think DeSean Jackson is going to get loose for a big play or 2. So I like DeSean Jackson here versus the Washington football team. Okay, who are we going to sit here at the wide receiver position? I'm going to sit Jamison Crowder from the New York Jets playing the Buffalo Bills, who had the 2nd best defense overall last year, and they gave up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Jamison Crowder averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game on the season last year, getting an average of 7.6 pass targets per game, and he was on the field for 79% of the snaps. He's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in week 1, but I'm going to stay away from this matchup versus the Buffalo Bills. And we know Vegas only thinks there's going to be 39.5 points scored in this game, so a low-scoring game with the Buffalo Bills favored by 6.5. So I'm going to sit Jamison Crowder here versus the Buffalo Bills. Okay, fantasy football, week 1, starts and sits. Let's take a look at the tight end position. I'm going to start Hayden Hurst from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Seattle Seahawks, who had the 13th worst defense overall last year, and they gave up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Now, Hayden Hurst, he only averaged 4.8 fantasy points per game on the season, and he only got an average of 2.4 pass targets per game. But remember, he had Austin Hooper that he had to compete with last year. Austin Hooper is now gone from the Atlanta Falcons, so Hayden Hurst is going to be the man. He did score 15 fantasy points in his last game last year off of 6 pass targets. So this guy's got some talent. and he's projected at 10.2 fantasy points here in week 1. It's a fantastic matchup here versus the Seattle Seahawks, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Seahawks favored by 3. So I like Hayden Hurst. Boo! So I'm going to start Hayden Hurst here versus the Seattle Seahawks. And speaking of Austin Hooper, I'm going to sit Austin Hooper from the Cleveland Browns playing the Baltimore Ravens, who had the 3rd best defense overall last year, and they gave up the absolute fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. So Austin Hooper is on the Cleveland Browns now, so you don't know how that change of team is going to affect his play. He's projected at 9 fantasy points here in week 1, but I'm going to stay away from this matchup with the Baltimore Ravens. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Ravens favored by 7.5. If you've got other options here at the tight end position, I would opt to leave Austin Hooper on your bench. So I'm going to sit Austin Hooper here in week 1 versus the Baltimore Ravens.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.